I'm going to start the session, my friends, with a welcome to this conversation. We've got some terrific panelists here with our friends from Brookings, Jordan Muchnick and Elaine Kamarck. And we've got Tom Shoop, the executive editor now of Government Executive Magazine.
Editor at large.
Editor at large. Well, that's good too.
Editor who does very little work.
That is so not true. It's a great group, and we're going to talk a little bit about some updates to some trend lines that I've been following for some time, and kind of the basic question that I'm going to start with as I get through this, and I'll go quickly, is what should be the management agenda right now? We've been talking already about whether there is one in the Biden administration, but the better question, given this talent that we have, is, what should be at the top of the list, assuming that there is a list. So let me get started here, just with a quick pull down here, if I can just get here. These are the 6 takeaways. Very quick, very simple. Our trend lines show rising demand for very major government reform. It's been going up for the last 10 years or so. The question for all of us is, well, what do you think the respondents are thinking when we ask, or they say we need very major government reform? There's no doubt some component there about wanting to get rid of this president or that president, but we'll talk about that in a second. Americans remain deeply divided about government reform. Number 3 takeaway is relates to the rising number of what I call government breakdowns. These are highly visible events where the federal government does not deliver on the promises it makes. And we're seeing an acceleration over the last 10, 15, 20 years in the number of breakdowns. Question being, well, what's that about? We'll talk a little bit about the thickening of government bloat, if you want to call it that, the number of layers. We'll talk a little bit about Joe Biden's ratings for running the federal government, and those have been in some decline. We only have a few months, about a year or so of data on his job ratings for, quote, running the federal government and its programs, but they are down. Those numbers are down. And then we've got a little bit of a conversation about careers in government. Our tracking trend shows that when we ask people to imagine a career in government for a son or daughter, how do they feel about that? And the support for careers in government has been falling. So what does this all sum to? This is the first slide here. The demand for reform is up. We saw a spike in 2018. We had a slight relaxation through the 2020 election, and then we see a bump in demand for very major reform recently. Question being is, well, is that a reaction to Joe Biden? Is that a reaction, another way of saying trust in government? But it's a concern, I would think. Any of my panelists here are just absolutely welcome to interpret what that word means. So we say, does the federal government need very major reform? Does it need only some reform, or does it not need much change at all? And you can see this recent bump, a little hump in 2018, and then a ratchet up more recently. The question for us is that something of significance? Should we be concerned? And what do we think Americans have on their minds when they're asked this question? Is this about Joe Biden? Is this about Trump? What's going on? So I want to ask Tom here what that term might mean.
Well, I think it means a lot of things at a lot of different times. And right now, we're in a situation where everybody has something to hate about what government is doing. So that makes it, that makes it a big challenge. And I'm not so sure I think these things, as the country becomes more politically polarized, become more political questions.
Yeah.
And you note in the report the effects of the change in administrations on people's attitudes.
It's a pretty smooth curve here, over time. A very large number that has been relatively stable, a little slip here and there. Jordan, Elaine, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would start with 1997 and not to be too obvious about it, but that was in the middle of the Clinton administration.
Right.
He was the last president who talked a lot about government reform and government management. There have been, I think the Bush administration made significant contributions. I think the Obama administration did. Even frankly, during the Trump administration, there were some interesting things that happened. But there's nothing like presidential attention to this topic. And I think the reason you see a sort of high point there of only some reform in 97 is that you had a president who began in 1992 talking about the need to reform government. It was in his State of the Unions. The end of the era of big government is over. We need government as much as we need and not one bit more. I mean, he focused on this. Nobody else focused on this. Now, with good reason. I mean, George Bush had to adapt the government to a war on terror. There was a major recession when Obama took over. I mean, everybody's had their crises. But the fact of the matter is that if you want the public to view government in a positive way and not be so angry about it, you do have to have the president of the United States talking about it. And frankly, it has been decades since we had a president who put this front and center in their presidency.
I tend to agree with you on that. Jordan's shaking his head as well. 1997 is the anchor point here, because that's when the Pew Research Center started ramping up. The Pew Charitable Trust made the big grant to start these trends, just broad investment in monitoring what people are thinking. I don't know whether this is a warning trend or whether it's an exhaustion trend. You're quite right that we just don't talk much about it. Tom Shoop, my dear friend, writes a lot about it. Yes, Tom?
Yeah, but here's the thing. I'm not so sure that, when you talk about what happened during the Clinton administration, that was a very different era. The world was not on fire in the way the world is on fire right now. I think we're a president to begin saying, my top priority now is reforming the federal hiring process. I think that would cause him more damage than good.
That he would be criticized for triviality, or?
Yes, for focusing on things that are
not central. Yeah.
Right.
No, Tom, I totally agree. But I still think that 1997 capped 5 years between a political campaign and a first term where Bill Clinton himself talked about this issue. And you're right, he had, in some ways, he had the liberty to talk about this issue because the world wasn't on fire. And I think that accounts for a lot of this. When a president is seen to be doing something to fix the government, the details never matter. We learned that the hard way. Nobody cares about the federal hiring process, et cetera, but the intention to shrink the government, to make it work better, et cetera, that I saw with my own eyes in 1996 on the campaign trail, how much political and public appreciation there was for that sort of messaging.
it took me decades to realize how unusual that was for them to have paid that much attention to those issues. This is when I was just starting out as a reporter, and I was getting invited to events at the White House and one-on-one interviews with Al Gore. And I thought, oh, this is the way it works. This is great.
Yeah, no, it was unusual.
Lauren, do you see this coming around? That could have President Biden pull it off? I mean, does he have anybody who we could anoint as reinventor in chief? Or would you have to reach out to Capitol Hill or to a governor someplace? I mean, or it's just the tide has gone out on major reform and the public might miss it a little bit.
Well, I certainly agree with Tom. I think that politics is a factor when you look at these numbers. I think whoever's in the White House obviously is going to encourage certain areas of support. I think it's really the most recent spike that we're looking at toward the end. A big part of that might actually have to do with government spending and how much is being spent on government. Obviously, in the 90s, the Clinton administration did a really good job of addressing the issue of spending and talking about cutting wasteful parts of government. And right now, we're dealing obviously with an inflation crisis, and that's sort of spiked up since the 2021 October numbers were shown. So I think that the concern around spending is sort of growing because of that inflation crisis. People want to make sure that their taxpayer dollars are being spent in the right way.
Right.
And so I think you see that to sort of increase demand to make sure that that spending is being done in a way that really helps them and helps them get through the current inflation crisis and isn't actually contributing to it.
We'll take a little bit. I'm going to skip this chart, which suggests this is a Pew chart that suggests that contact with federal agency is neither help nor foe in support. I do want to get you to this division about government reform. We have these four categories where we mix two questions together. One is whether the government needs very major reform or is basically sound, and the other is we want a bigger government or a smaller government. This leads us to this chart here, which answers, if I can get it to go, which of course is this kind of answers the question that I think or addresses the analysis that Jordan makes. Take a look at the rising number of what I call the dismantlers, just over the last few months, really, barely a year and a half or so. The dismantlers are folks who believe that the government needs very major reform and they want smaller government. Over to the far right of this chart are the expanders. They don't think the federal government needs major reform, just a little bit of tinkering perhaps, and they want bigger government. You can see the rapid rise over the last 18 months or so in the number of dismantlers. And those red dismantlers are Donald Trump's base. That's what I interpret from looking at the party identification, income, and so forth. And you can just see it running up. This is a group of people, a very large percentage of the electorate, perhaps, although within the dismantlers are some folks who just don't vote and they don't think much about it. But you can see this rapid run up. And that's what we're seeing, I think, in the demand for major reform. It's no surprise to, this is a blend of the major reform question and the size of government. So these things are blended together. I'm thinking that we are looking for 2022 in the midterms, some sort of spike perhaps in the number of voters who are going to turn to that dismantle position. But I'm not sure we have a candidate emergent yet for 2024. Any thoughts on this one real quickly, my friends?
Paul, has there been any discernible rise in dismantlers on the left?
There is some, but it's a question there where it has this blend has so much of a link to who's president at any given time. So you see in 2015, this run up before the 2016 election, then you get a fall as respondents are trying to sort of process. It's hard for me to make that jump. It's not unstable data, but you can't go too far with it. So I'm going to evade the question ever so slightly, or actually quite aggressively. Any other thoughts on this? Is this a warning sign to Biden when you look to the right, which are the expanders? I tend to view the rebuilders, these folks who say basically the government doesn't need, they want a smaller government to some extent, and they don't think it needs very major reform. There's just not a lot of movement except for those red bars. And, we can talk about that a little bit from now. Let me continue down here. I want to turn to this breakdowns in the news. The concept of a breakdown is very straightforward. It's in the news. It's highly visible. There is a clear link between the failure involved and government action or inaction. There's a long list of sources for each one of these. The Oklahoma City bombing, the Exxon Valdez, were these all preventable? Not always, but you see things like the IRS website crash and so forth. Let me take you into this trend, which suggests that there's been an increase in the number of breakdowns. It's the kind of chart that has a very straight linear lift to it. And the question here is whether we are in a period in the absence of significant government reforms where the government is starting to break down with greater frequency. And that's the question I'd like to point to put to my three colleagues here. Is this a sign of real threat to government performance, or just an aging effect that we might expect? And maybe it's a measurement effect. Any thoughts on this? I'm going to ask Elaine to fire first here.
Yeah.
Is this a real trend or just kind of an anomaly?
I think it's a real trend, and it coincides with the thesis I had in a book I wrote, Why Presidents Fail. And I think what's going on here, and I put it in my book as very much a 21st century phenomenon. We are electing presidents for their communication skills and their, ability to mobilize and inspire the public. And there is no regard any longer in the nomination process for people, for experience and management. And so what we get presidents of the United States who are constantly being blindsided by things that happen in their own government. I would add, Paul, to your list, because I don't know exactly what the criteria is, but during Obama, we had the Veterans Administration scandals, where basically they were hornswoggled by the VA, and the VA health system was breaking down. People were dying. It was a big story while it happened. And the Obama administration basically acted like, and there's even some quotes to this effect, like, oh God, we didn't see this coming. We didn't know about it. Although the Bush administration had warned them in transition papers that something was wrong was going on at VA. You saw it with Trump, with the entire way that he managed the COVID, with the sole exception of Operation Warp Speed. And then, of course, you saw it with Biden in the Afghanistan debacle, which I maintain the Afghanistan debacle really hurt Biden. If you look at his polling, his approval numbers, they take a deep dive in late August and early September of his first year in office, and they do not come back. They do not come back. And so I think that part of this is, and by the way, along with our presidential nomination system featuring sort of celebrity type people over boring government people, you have the second phenomenon, which is that the people who go into White Houses with modern presidents and have the most clout with the presidents tend to be people who are message people, communications people. So, you know, strikingly, as President Obama's healthcare websites were crashing all over the country, what does he do? He went to Boston to give a speech about healthcare, about the importance of healthcare. No, 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 no. You know, fix the websites. That's what people, it didn't impact at all because people wanted him to fix the websites. So there's, I think what's going on in a broad historical sweep is that we have been electing presidents who are less able to manage this gargantuan thing called the federal government than earlier presidents, and therefore they don't fix things. They don't appoint people as cabinet secretaries who have significant management experience and can see these things coming. In all of the things that I've looked at, all the failures, because I too, like you, Paul, have been obsessed with this question of government failures. When there is an after action review, which is critical to doing this, the after action review almost always shows the warning signs, that there were significant warning signs, but they could not get through the system to the president, to the White House. And so preventive action was just impossible. And then the second thing you see in all these after action reviews is that there are some quite sound recommendations made, and they're often, by the time the review comes out and makes one or two news stories, etc., interest wanes and nobody actually fixes anything. So I think this is real. I think it is unique to the 21st century. And I think that it has something to do with the way we nominate presidents. And even though President Biden was certainly the most experienced president we've had, the fact is that until he was vice president, he never had executive experience. And I think that it shows, and I think it's showing from time to time. I suspect there might be more breakdowns.
It'd be a wise bet, unfortunately. Tom, John, or Jordan, yeah.
Well, it's a couple of things. One is I agree the trend is in essence real. I question a certain amount of recency bias in looking at it. And I also, I'll put this as delicately as I can. The notion that there were as many breakdowns in Biden's first year in office as in all of Trump's 4 years, which was literally a breakdown a day,
Yeah,
at least. I think that just comes off as a little bit skewed to me. Having said that, I must, as a representative of the media, point out that, and you point out this in the report, the media plays a very strong role in this perception of breakdowns. And you note that things get done for ratings, but even more so than that these days, things get reported for clicks. And the notion that the federal government couldn't run a one-car funeral is deeply entrenched in the reporting on government operations. So partly as a result of that, we've reached a point where people are, in essence, allergic to good news about government. They don't believe it at all. We had a plague attack the world, and in a little over a year, the federal government developed and distributed a vaccine, and collectively we went, oh, well, the rollout wasn't that great. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
That sort of view of, essentially a cynical view of government, is at to me, an all-time high.
I do. You're absolutely right about if it bleeds, it leads, right? And the notion that the media, not your wonderful publication, but let's say the electronic media might spin the worst case, no doubt about it. This whole indicator here is based on breakdowns in the news. So the whole methodology starts with, okay, what have people been paying attention to? Go through that, really try to winnow it down and then say, well, was it significant? Was there a significant contributor, a failure of some kind? Then you go from there, you're looking. So the notion that one station, Fox or CNN or whatever, is going to really put the pressure on a story because it has valence in the audience, I mean, I don't doubt it at all. The problem is, or the question at hand is whether basically government is producing more breakdowns because we're not fixing stuff. So I'm going to draw your attention here to the next slide, if I can just get it. This is a long trend line based on total number of enacted legislation that deal with fixing government. This is a congressional quarterly based analysis of sort of what Congress has been doing. And you can see a very significant number of enacted bills under Clinton and Carter and all the way back to Truman. We get somewhat some movement under Obama, but really the amount of effort now underway to enact large-scale management reforms, it's just not looking like Congress is capable of doing it. This goes to your point, Elaine. Is there capacity to do this? Does Congress have capacity? One of the questions to ask is, how are our peak legislative committees doing on this? The old-timey government ops committee, the old-timey government operations and reform committees. How are we doing down there in terms of the nitty-gritty hard work of coming up with significant fixes? It's just a question to put here, but this is one of those things where you say, okay, we've got a decline in the amount of management reform, and we've got a ramp up in the number of breakdowns. Is that a cause and effect, my friends?
Well, let me take that on. I mean, this is this I think, Paul, is a fascinating chart. And what it also tracks, though, is the trend in Congress to do all their work through reconciliation. I mean, they can't even finish an appropriations bill. Okay, they won't finish the appropriations bill this year. I think you have to go back to the 90s. Tom would know better than me for the last time they actually passed 13 appropriations bills. But when you go to government by reconciliation, things like management reforms, which don't have a budgetary impact, a clear budgetary impact, they're thrown out of the reconciliation bill. So all sorts of things that we used to do, or Congress used to do through its authorizing committees, they're not doing anymore. And management is just one of the things. They're not doing normal day-to-day oversight. Okay, as the political scientists used to say, they do fire alarm oversight. In other words, when something blows up and goes wrong, they do oversight, but they're not doing day-to-day oversight anymore. And that's where a lot of these management reforms come from. And in addition to, if you have a White House that is focused on this, you'll get a lot of management reform. But this is a problem not just for management issues, it's a problem all across the government. And it stems from this government by reconciliation, which we've seen so much of in the last 20 years.
Paul, can I ask you a couple of questions?
Sure.
One serious and one semi-flippant. The serious one is, does this count reform bills included in the defense authorization bill? Because that's become the vehicle for a lot of government-wide reforms recently.
This is this is based on a reasonable assessment of the annual congressional quarterly almanacs. So what I do is I go to the almanac, I start reading through the list of major legislation, and if the almanac says, well, this was a big package here that dealt with civil service reform, which near as I can tell would be number one in terms of let's fix that right now. But it's a very straightforward, what did Congress do? And therefore, you're quite right, Elaine and Tom, Jordan, to ask, well, does this include reconciliation? And it only includes reconciliation to the extent in this particular methodology that the Congressional Quarterly Almanac speaks specifically to the management reform. That's how it shows up. So there's some undercounting, no doubt, but I'm thinking that, I started out with the governmental affairs and operations under Senator Glenn. I just don't know what the state of these big legislative oversight committees are. I don't know what's happening over in the House, and I'm not sure whether either of these giant committees are much involved. Elaine, you're basically saying that most of the reform is occurring in the budget authorizations committees. Where is it happening, if it's happening at all?
Well, let me talk to that for a minute, and let me use civil service reform as an example. In a very polarized political setting, and this was true, by the way, in the Clinton administration, and it's more true now, civil service reform is a complete dead end in the government, right? You just, nobody in their right mind even bothers with it. For one reason, is that there's no middle. There's no interested parties in civil service reform. There's either people on the right who want to kill the federal government unions and take that as a blast against unionization, and there's people on the left who'd like to expand the size of government, the scope of government unions, their power, etc. So frankly, there's just no middle there. I thought at one point that maybe Joe Lieberman would be the middle, and not even Joe Lieberman wanted to take this on. Because of polarization, large-scale management reforms are simply not done anymore. But that doesn't mean that things aren't happening. So if I go back to my civil service reform example, if you look, and there's a political scientist who's been paying attention to this, if you look at the number of federal civil servants who are no longer covered by Title V, the civil service law, because they have gotten out of Title V through one little amendment here to this bill or little amendment here to that bill, that is a very large number, which has been increasing. I think the last time I looked, it was 51%. In other words, half of the federal government is no longer covered by the civil service. So the civil service has been being reformed in a sort of ground up way, agency by agency. National Institutes of Health even lifted the cap on civil service salaries because, of course, it's very important for them to be competitive in a very highly skilled and highly educated market. So what I think has been happening here is that there's simply the polarization makes these large scale efforts impossible. They were possible in the Clinton era because we had some polarization, but it was a different era and we had a president who focused on this. But I think large scale management reforms are simply impossible. To the extent they are happening, I think they're happening sub rosa, agency by agency. And as a research point, I have no idea how you'd track that. I mean, it's a mammoth undertaking, but I can tell you anecdotally that has happened with civil service reform.
Paul, if there's anything your report shows, it's that things have gotten worse over recent decades in terms of management of government, accelerating breakdowns, et cetera. So it seems to me that the management reforms that were enacted didn't work. So my question is, why would we want more of them?
Well, one of the things that comes up here is, and I don't want to go too much or too deep into the academic weeds. When we look at our public policy and administration programs, there's more and more focus these days on designing policies, right? And much of the conversation about designing policy, whether it's for environmental or for employment or whatever, is that we're using a whole set of implementation systems, nudges, and self-executing devices, and we don't pay much attention in the discussion of what to do about big problems. We don't pay as much attention as we should to the implementation. It's almost the deification of the self-executing policy that we're kind of confused about how we would create reforms that make government more responsive. You're dealing with the civil service system and so forth. And people are like, you can't do much there. Let's design better policy that doesn't require as much execution by traditional government systems. I hope I'm making sense here, but it's this notion in our schools and our training programs that design the policy and then hope it gets implemented, as opposed to design the policy so that it can be implemented. I just don't know how to deal with that. It's been troubling me for some years now. So I don't know whether this is a brief for significant government reform that can't be done, or whether it's a brief for more nudges a la Cass Sunstein and that community. I'm confused by it, but it does tell us something. Breakdowns going up, amount of reform going down, but maybe the amount of reform is going down because we can't figure out what the heck to do. Oh, there you go.
Paul, I have an anecdote for this. My father, my late father, worked at the Social Security Administration when Medicare was passed. And when they were writing the Medicare legislation, 1963, 64, 65 in there, the head of Social Security and the senior civil servants, my dad was a kid then, were involved with the legislators writing the legislation to make sure that it was in a system that was going to work for implementation. And that I don't hear that very much anymore. I don't know that members of Congress actually include the civil servants in their design and in their work. So it's kind of another way of making your point, that we've been leaving out implementation because we've been just focusing on policy, and focusing on policy that we think can be done somehow without any implementation.
Well, I'm not making a recommendation for calling Jack Brooks back to work over on the House side, but it'd be nice to have a strong set of government ops committees that are paying attention to these issues, but I just don't know that anybody's home. I want to, Tom, do you have a comment?
No.
Okay.
Shockingly. I'm going to skip past the layers and the leaders and layers. We've been here. The thickening of government continues. This is a little slide showing Biden's job rating for running the federal government's program. This is a very specific question. We say basically, how is Joe Biden doing running the federal government and its programs? And you can see really a fairly significant decline over a relatively short period in his excellent and good ratings, and a significant increase in his fair and poor ratings. I don't know that anybody's paying attention to it, but it's a troubling trend if you're Joe Biden and you're thinking about what the effect might be this fall. We've got this chart on how Americans rate the federal government's performance. Here's the one I want to focus here. I want to ask Jordan, is there any hope if you want to go into government
I mean, this particular question's been around for a fair amount of time. We see a decline in the number of people who would recommend a career in government to a son or daughter. It's a very straightforward question, and we see some fairly significant erosion over the past 2 years. It's significant enough to raise concern. So the real question I'd asked Jordan to think about this, what's going on here? I mean, this is the lifeblood. You've got parents, the key decision makers. We've got organizations like the Volcker Alliance, trying to figure out how to get young people interested in public service. What's going on here? Is there a significant crisis? The second thing I'd point you to is the number of don't know, no answer responses to this question. Fairly significant change over time. People saying, I don't know. And then you've got the decline all totaled in the number of people who either don't know or just don't recommend a career in government. That's got state and local mixed in. That's got federal. I don't know to what degree people are thinking about defense, other government careers, state and local. It's a very broad question, but there's something going on. Jordan, you got an answer on this one? What's going on?
I'll do the best that I can. I think it does track nicely with the sort of overall decline in the public confidence in institutions that you've seen over the past couple of decades. And I think it's been amplified certainly a lot more over the past 4 or 5 years. I can say from, I think, a young person's perspective of deciding if you want to go into government, a key element to that is finding an area of interest in public policy that you're interested in. I don't think that's actually a big problem for young people. I think I'm actually part of a very conscious generation that's aware of a lot of the issues facing the country. This is because I think we grew up with social media, so we're constantly being inundated with the problems of the day, and we're constantly discussing many of the key issues. I think there's a double-edged sword to this, though, in that because a lot of this interest comes from social media. A key element of social media is the instant gratification that comes from tweeting or sort of using it to advocate for certain issues that you might care about. So what ends up happening is I think you have a lot of young people who do care about the major issues in the country, but they don't see government as an effective way of really sort of addressing how to solve these problems or sort of streamlining the process. They view government and bureaucracy in general as something that's very complex, very layered. It's like that on purpose for obvious reasons. But for a generation that's very used to this sort of instant gratification, it's not a very tantalizing thing to want to get involved in something that's very big, very difficult. And I think there's definitely a pessimism among younger people about the ability of government to address a lot of the issues that we're facing. And then as for, the issues around whether you recommend it to your kid, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think that you can see there is a cross-generational distrust of institutions that's very troubling. I don't know what the solution to that is, because I think we're sort of entering a new brave world phase of the sort of social media landscape. But yeah, I wish I could have a better, more optimistic answer, but really at this point, it's sort of up in the air. It all depends on how we evolve over time in terms of how we take in the information that we get from social media and how we view government's ability to actually enact change.
Are we seeing anything, Tom, in the recruitment conversation? I mean, how's the federal government doing from your perspective?
Not great. But the number one problem in the federal government in recruiting is that the baby boomers won't retire and get out of the way. I would say that I think that, the slightly optimistic view of this may be that if you want to make a difference, you don't have to work in government. It's not the Kennedy era. And I think people perceive that there are private companies and nonprofit organizations that are genuinely making a difference. And if they want to do that, there was some years ago, there was a lot of polling data about from recent graduates saying, we just don't think the government is where the action is in terms of getting things done on things like climate change and big issues like that.
We continue to run our occasional estimates on the true size of the federal workforce. It's a nightmare project where you're trying to estimate the number of contractors, the number of grantees, in terms of the true size, the true head count. That's a very squishy analysis, but it's pretty solid. Last year, we saw a significant, well, if 70,000 jobs is significant in government with this many contractors, grantees, and civil servants, the federal government's total footprint went down by 70,000 slots, largely through reductions in the defense budget. So this very large organization, the federal government, and in terms of its workforce, which can include state and local, can include nonprofits, certainly includes contractors of one kind or another, it went down ever so slightly. I didn't hear anything from the Biden administration. Elaine, your thoughts on this? Do you really want to celebrate a 70,000 FTE reduction in the federal workforce when the remainder is still very, very high, or do you just better not talk about it? We have seen some decline associated with the rollback in defense spending post-Trump. Anything to say about that one in terms of its political value, or should it just be not talked about too widely? Because that number may rebound quickly, depending on what we do in the next 5 years.
You know, Paul, this is something that you and I have talked about that I think that I know at Brookings we're going to spend some time on in the coming year. It's a very complicated question because the question really is what is inherently governmental and what isn't. And of course, there's a political aspect to that too, which is in Republican administrations, a lot more things are not inherently governmental, and in a Democratic administration, a lot of things are. So this does vary somewhat. But I also think that we need to be a little bit clearer than we've been about this inherently governmental question.
Yeah.
There are, we've gone through a period of huge transition in the federal government from paper to online, right? Services, taxes, et cetera. I mean, at the beginning of the Clinton administration, the big innovation was you could file a 1040 easy over the phone. Right. And that was quickly eclipsed by internet filing, which is now dominant, okay, in a relatively short period of time. Now, a lot of the contracting has been that IT had to come in and help the federal government move, right, from one huge systems to another system. So a lot of that was, I think, IT driven. I would expect, and again, there's anecdotal evidence on this, I would expect that as people in the government, as the generation changes and as you say, the baby boomers retire and people like Jordan with better, internet skills get into the government, that you won't need as much outside contracting to run these IT systems as we have seen. So I think a part of that is this transition, but I also think a part of this is a very fuzzy notion of what is inherently governmental and what is not. And that we need to really figure that out in a nonpartisan way, which is why we're doing this project with Niskanen, with the Niskanen Foundation, in order to try and sort out the issue of non-governmental. And finally, what we have developed in the last several decades is a non-bureaucratic approach to government. We've looked at nudges, we've looked at markets, we've looked at networks, nonprofit networks, et cetera. So there is a sense in which the very definition of what's government has changed and government implementation has changed. So I think all of those things go into, what does it mean when you say the government has shrunk?
Yes. Its footprint, for sure, whether counting heads of any kind really is,
Makes any difference.
well, does it tell us anything? So, I mean.
Well, and
maybe-
let me add one other point to this.
Yeah.
It may be that we count fewer heads. I think the problem might be that those fewer heads need to be higher paid and highly educated, because what they're doing now is they're not supervising a system of 50 clerks, right, and checking their work. They're supervising complicated systems, markets, networks of providers, et cetera. And that's very different. There may be fewer heads, but we have to take into account that they have to be more highly paid to be competitive in the market.
We've got a few minutes left here, so here's the question. And I do want to thank all of you for coming to this. And I appreciate your input here. These are trend lines. You can see that I became obsessed with them to some extent. Tom, don't smile. I wouldn't call it obsession, trend line obsession. But maybe I should wait a few years before I do another one of these analyses. Tom McIntyre was very helpful here. Rob Holmer did some very helpful work on this. Kate Dunn, and of course, Polly. It's really a delight to have the NYU team and the Brookings team working together. I'm proud to be part of FixGov. I looked at my posting today, and it's a nice thing, this FixGov. And the only thing better is a byline at GovExec. So that's all good. Have I kissed everything at this particular point? I want to ask the three of you, what's next here? Do we just let this boil? We've got some warning signs here. Is there some next step as we look at these warning signs, or do we just let it come? Who's in the administration that might be interested in taking this on? I just don't know. Tom, Elaine?
I think in terms of next steps, it's difficult to pin down exactly what the right answer might be. I think to Elaine's earlier point about who we're electing presidents, I believe that a lot of these breakdowns are not management failures or failures of systems, but failures of leadership.
Okay.
And that's not a problem that can be fixed legislatively or through some internal bureaucratic process. So that gives me pause. I also think, to my earlier point, we have to reach a point, Paul, that I was inspired by your work on this to do a piece on 6 great things government has done in the past 20 years. And I think in particular in the past 20 years, people tend to think that the government has done nothing of any consequence. And my list didn't include things like that people in government tend to say a lot, like we take for granted that the planes don't fall out of the sky. Yeah, that's your job. These are 6 things I found that were genuinely helpful and innovative and whatever. And the last thing I would say is, I think that the Clinton administration left an interesting legacy on this. On the one hand, they proved that with sustained attention from the very top and engagement with the career civil service, you could effect genuine change in how government works and how it's structured. They also proved there's no political payoff for that whatsoever. Hence, Reinventing Government became Reinventing Government 2, which was just an exercise in Me Tooing the Republican effort to cut government. So I think that, and Biden himself, I don't hold out a ton of hope that he'll make these kinds of changes, because when asked directly by President Obama if he was interested, he said, no, I'm not. So I hate to end on that sort of bleak note. I do think that there holds out hope that he could grow into becoming a better executive leader than maybe he has been. But I don't foresee a world in which there's White House attention to these issues in the next few years.
Biden, I thought for a while that maybe I was too negative with Biden in this piece, because I say he doesn't have an agenda. There was that interaction with the Obama folks about whether he might like sort of notion, would you like to do this? And his reaction, what did he say?
He has a vision. You linked to it.
Yeah, right, right. So that's an issue. So is there anybody out there ready to step forward? I just don't know. I'm going to save the last comment for Jordan, but Elaine, you got a next step? You got the person who could lead such an effort? I'm thinking you could do it in your sleep.
Well, obviously, I could do it. A lot of other people could do it. I would draw attention to Jeff Zients, who was brought into who did a lot of this in the Obama White House, but who was brought in to get rid of the backlogs in the vaccine distribution issue. And he did a terrific job. It's in fact reflected in the fact that in the first 6 months of the Biden administration, Biden's approval numbers were up, the satisfaction was up, et cetera. Why? Because Jeff Zients helped break the backlog that was getting vaccines into people's arms. So I do think that Jeff Zients could do this. I think there's a lot of talented people around to do it, but ultimately a management agenda has to coincide with a political agenda, or else it's simply not going to have the prominence in a White House that you need. For Bill Clinton, this was part of being a new Democrat. He had to prove to the country that he was a different kind of Democrat. That may be the case in the future too. And this is, by the way, the sort of thing that Democrats have to do more than Republicans. Yes. Just like Nixon, just like it was only Nixon that could go to China, it's really only Democrats that can cut government. Because unlike for Republicans, government failure simply proves their point that the problem is government. For Democrats, Democrats want government to succeed, but they have to tap into this deep distrust, and they have to prove that government can work, which means that the cutting problem is, and I'll go back to an often used analogy here, cutting the fat out of government is like cutting the fat out of a good piece of steak, right? You don't just lop it off, right? It's a very careful process, but it can be done. And so I think that the next step is actually find a leader for whom the political and the management come together.
And if you got names, we should talk about it. I just don't see anybody, but it's not a governor, I don't think. I just don't know. Jordan, last comment. It's a pleasure having you involved in this. We expect you to fill out these trend lines in the next round. Any final word?
Yeah, no, I think it would be interesting for you to reassess this in five years or so, because I think right now we're going through a serious transition period in so many different ways. We're coming out of a pandemic still. I think a lot of sectors, especially in the economy, are still recovering from that. We're going through a weird period of high inflation but low unemployment. So people don't really know how to handle that. I think politically there's a lot of instability right now, of course. I think people are not sure about the future of the Joe Biden presidency, about his prospects of running again in 2024. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with the Republican Party, with whether Trump will run or whether there'll be an alternative in DeSantis. So I think all this uncertainty results in people who are very pessimistic about government. And I think as I said, I don't know if it'll be in 5 years, but if we were somehow coming out of 2024 to have a more sort of stable outlook in terms of the direction that the country is headed in, and where we're at, then I think that would be a good time to assess. Because I think just right now there's just so much uncertainty that's just sort of spreading across the country.
Very useful. You know, I do so appreciate that the three of you have joined me today. The affiliation and work with governance studies and with the Center for Effective Public Management, all good, and a pleasure to be on the website with you. Thank you so much for coming. Perhaps we're part of a brain trust that could be helpful in pushing this forward in coming years. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty in these charts for sure. So my very best to you, my appreciation. Tom, really good to see you. Elaine, wonderful. Jordan, we're going to do some work together. Okay, all my best to you. Have a good day and stay cool. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.